Well, hello and welcome to episode 100 of a Plain Accounts podcast series. And we are just so excited that we have made it this far. And we are just so thankful for all the people who have supported us up to this point and are fantastic contributors. And today, for our 100th episode, we have one of my favorite commentators as well as authors, Shawna Songer Gaines, who is the chaplain at Trevecca University. Shawna, thank you so much for joining us for our 100th episode.
Yeah, it's an honor. In fact, well, Ben, you didn't tell me that today was the 100th episode. I would have had balloons or something for you. Congratulations.
Thank you. I would have dressed up a little bit better, if I wasn't just moving someone. But yeah, it's a big milestone.
That's awesome.
Well, would you let our audience know what it is you're up to recently in ministry, a little bit about your role there as chaplain?
Yeah, so a university chaplain here at Trevecca. I'm finishing up my second year in this role. Before the podcast started airing, Ben and I we were talking a little bit about the interesting pastoral nature here on a university campus, especially when you think about kind of the cycle of the church year. So in the fall semester, we welcome them during ordinary time, and we get halfway through Advent with them, and then we send them back off to their local churches to light the Christ candle on Christmas Eve and sing joy to the world and all that kind of good stuff. And then we get them back kind of halfway through Epiphany, or maybe just a little bit into Epiphany, and we walk all through Lent with them. And then we have a Tenebrae service that's actually on Maundy, Thursday, and we send them out in darkness. They come back to us, after they've celebrated Easter in their home churches. And so it's just it's a different kind of role pastorally, to think about myself as sort of sharing these students and sharing the discipleship task with local pastors all over the country, and how to be a good partner to them, and to not see the work that I do as being kind of isolated, but to see the work that I do as like having just tons of partners all over the place. So
Right.
It's fun. Yeah, these are good days.
That's incredible. I've always wondered, is the rhythm of preaching, because you preach probably 3 times a week, right?
Oh my goodness, bless you. No.
But I thought it was Monday, Wednesday, Friday that maybe you had.
But I don't preach at all the chapels. Okay. So yeah, we've got a Monday night chapel and a Tuesday, Thursday chapel. I preached this morning, but I preach about 8 times a semester, and we do lots of other things throughout the semester. There are times I think, oh, I wish I were preaching every week, and then there are other times I think I don't even know how to manage all that I am preaching.
Right.
But I do a lot of other preaching in other settings. But here at Trevecca, I preach about 8 times throughout the semester, which again it's a very different rhythm. So preaching on a Thursday morning is way different than preaching on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
When I was pastoring in a local church, I'm telling you, Ben, and I feel like I need to repent for this, but just so critical of pastors who were working on their sermons on Saturday night. I was like, how in the world could you neglect the responsibility of the word and wait till Saturday night? I mean, I really just felt like, and partly because the rhythm of my week just allowed for a lot of that study and preparation earlier on. Well, now that I'm in a setting where I might be preaching Tuesday morning, I might be preaching Thursday morning, I'm asked to preach at a lot of local churches on Sundays or for weekend retreats and things like that. And every week is different. I never know what day of the week I'm going to be preaching, what time of the day. And so it's not that just rhythmic Sunday morning kind of cycle anymore. And I really struggled to put into place a new preaching preparation rhythm. I used to have a rhythm that started Monday morning and concluded about Thursday afternoon. And I took Friday and Saturday off, and I woke up Sunday morning really early, feeling ready, for that week. And I woke up this morning really early with my stomach in knots because I did not feel as ready as I wanted to feel. And so it's just a very different kind of rhythm. University life is, in fact, I was just talking with some folks about the fact that when you work with students, you have to understand that they're always under the tyranny of the immediate. And so everybody on campus sort of feels that we're tyrannized by the immediate constantly. And so making time and space for quiet reflection, preparation is, a unique challenge, but not impossible.
Wow. Wow, that's fascinating. Well, thank you so much for giving us opening the veil a little bit on the life of a
Yeah,
university
there it is.
chaplain. It's definitely shepherding, but shepherding in a very different rhythm in a
Yeah.
different context. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we are going to be looking at John chapter 10, 11 through 18. And if you haven't yet gone to read the commentary that Shawna provided for us on this passage, please do so. We also have 3 other exceptional commentaries this week, so be sure to go and read those to prepare for your preaching this week. We are just coming from hearing from Thomas 2 weeks ago to preparing for the pouring out of the Holy Spirit in Pentecost. So we're kind of in between in that Easter tide, moving towards the Pentecost event in the book of Acts. And so this passage falls right in between how we are to perhaps lead in the midst of the reality of the resurrection. So we're going to be looking at that conversation between Jesus and Peter and hear a bit about what Jesus says in the book of John. I'm going to be reading this passage from the NIV version as we begin our conversation. John 10, starting with verse 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. The written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So, what's a good starting point for these words of Jesus? How can we understand the context in which Jesus is saying these words in a bit deeper way?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I explore a bit in the commentary, first is the immediate context there in John's gospel, that this is a part of kind of a larger conversation that Jesus is having, where he first says, I am the gate to the sheep, and then I am the good shepherd. But he's having this conversation in the company of Pharisees who have just essentially tried a man who was born blind and healed by Jesus after some mud was put on his eyes. And the Pharisees are sort of in uproar about this, and they end up casting this man out, right? And so you can't divorce what's being said here from the fact that he's in the presence of folks who would love to have the title of the leaders of the flock of Israel, right?
Right.
And so this idea that he's in the presence of the leaders, and so you hear then these words of, I am the good shepherd, talking about not putting these into the care of others, that this is really an indictment on the leaders of Israel, and an indictment really even on those who he is currently sharing company with.
Yeah.
So these are some tense words. I think we read, oh, I am the good shepherd, and we have images of Jesus with a little lamb in his arm and a staff, and it sounds really wonderful and VBS picturesque. But I think that there's this very challenging word in many ways, like challenging the leadership of Israel. So partly putting it in that kind of context, I think is really helpful. When I've preached this passage, and this is one that I feel like as a preacher, and Ben, maybe you'd agree as you've been working with the passage this week, but it comes from kind of a tender place, right? Where those of us who are preachers, we feel like this is the call that God's put on our life to be a shepherd to the flock. And so you prepare this, and you kind of can't help but go to that very sort of tender, vulnerable place of even conviction about what it means to pursue this call that God's placed in your life. I mean, did you kind of feel that a little bit this week?
Absolutely. I felt that it really did make me question what my definition again is of power and authority. How do I see this role and the authority that comes with it through the lens of the narrative of the shepherd, rather than any other sort of narrative of power that we see in the world today?
Yeah, that the picture of the shepherd is such a countercultural image of leadership. And so I explored that a little bit in the commentary as well, that throughout the history of Israel asking for a king, that the shepherd was always meant to sort of be that countercultural image of leader. So when the Lord anoints David to be the king, and here you've got the shepherd boy who doesn't have any of the qualifications that Saul, who kind of looks like your typical leader king would have.
Right.
Lord says, you will shepherd my people. Throughout the prophetic text, the prophets are always calling the leaders to be shepherds and indicting them when they have been bad shepherds, when they have not cared for the flock, and really when they've exploited the flock. I think that throughout the Old Testament, that's what we see very clearly, is that when the leaders of Israel have exploited the flock, that there is hell to pay, right? And that
Right.
this is something that God takes very seriously. So, as I've tried to kind of personalize that when I preach this text, there's a story that I tell to kind of give a little bit of a sense of what this shared, because this is sort of a shared relationship in many ways, where God says, these are my people, but I've asked you to take care of them, right? Like, I am the good shepherd, they are my flock. But then later in John's gospel, you have Jesus saying to Peter, if you love me, feed my sheep. So you've got this kind of almost like shared parenting going on, right? And so, when I preached this text, I told the story of taking my kids to swim lessons this last summer. They were 3 and 5 at the time, taking them to swim lessons. And I get to swim class, and the swim instructors make it very clear, kids can come in the pool. Parents, you go sit over there on the bleachers. We will have your kids for this hour. You stay over there and stay out of our way. So, that was fine for a couple of days. And then I show up one day, and it's clear that they're understaffed. Like, I don't know, a couple of their instructors haven't showed up, but they're definitely understaffed. And I drop my kids off, and I go over to the parent bleachers, and I'm looking in the water, and I realize that they only have like one instructor and one very disengaged lifeguard for 20 3 to 5-year-olds.
No.
Just insane. Like, it's chaos. And they're in this giant, we're at Vanderbilt. So we're in this giant Olympic sized pool. And I'm looking at my daughter, who's 3 at the time, and she's a handful. And so she's trying to like dive off the steps and just go swim, laps in the pool. And it's making my heart race. And so, of course, like, I didn't stay in the bleachers, right? I stormed down from the bleachers and came to the side of the pool. And the swim instructor was giving me looks like, come on, helicopter mom, I've got this. And so I've had a little bit of fun with that when I preached this text, that, if she were to oppress me a little bit more, I would have had to have a conversation about what our roles were in caretaking for these children, right? Like, her job is to be the swim instructor that teaches my kids to kick and stroke. My job is to be the mother who cares more than anybody else on the face of this planet that my 2 children make it out of the pool alive at the end, right? Like, we have 2 very distinct jobs here. And so I think that there is kind of that parental sense when you hear Jesus's words of saying, I am the good shepherd. In a sense, it's like God saying, I will not be relegated to the parent bleachers any longer. Like, I am coming to the side of the pool to care for my children myself, because there is no swim instructor or hired hand who can do this job, right? And that there are some jobs that you just cannot hire out. And so pastorally, I think, man, that's so challenging for us to think about that we can't hire out this work, right? Like, this is this work of shepherding that we're called to. It can't be hired out to a great program or whatever the latest ministry conference you went to or book that you've been reading. There is a sense in which we have been anointed for this task that only a shepherd can do, and it can't be hired out to a hired hand. So, yeah.
Well, I just loved that contrast in your commentary about how I think it was the first time that I've really looked at it this way, where the pen itself can become a pen of protection or a pen of containment, depending on the leader of or the keeper of that pen. How the shepherd operates that wall can be something that is used for the benefit of the shepherd or used for the benefit of the sheep. And if it's a hired hand, then it's a contractual obligation that can be broken at the preference of the shepherd, rather than one who is in loving relationship with God and the sheep, the people. That love can't be broken that easily just by mere preference. It's a united covenant with those people, and I just loved that contrast, because the shepherd is one who's willing to lay down his life for the sheep, and that's not a contract there.
Right. Yeah. And that's, I think, that's a tricky one to kind of explore when we talk about, like, okay, today, what does that look like as we exegete our context, right? That there is a sense in which we still very much live in a day and age where it's much easier to keep people penned up intellectually, spiritually, to say that you must kind of live in this very contained space, adhere to this. And in some ways, there is some of that that's for safety, right? That really is for caring for the flock, not wanting people to roam and wander. I get that working with college students. Like, we have rules on this campus that are like wanting to care for our sheep so that they don't roam and wander into a place where they might really get hurt. But then there is also a sense which sometimes those boundaries can serve to benefit the gatekeepers and not the sheep, where it becomes convenient ways to know exactly who your followers are, or have kind of control, authority, influence, and power. And it becomes more about the gatekeepers than about care for the sheep.
Right.
And ideologically, I think these days we're wrestling with this, feeling like there are particular ideological litmus tests that you must pass in order to be counted as faithful. And so I think that this is tricky, right? Like, we do need to be a part of a bounded community, but that those boundaries are for the care and the well-being of the flock, and not for the power and authority of the gatekeepers.
Absolutely. And I think so easy we can read passages like this and say, oh, the Pharisees are thieves. Or like you mentioned in your commentary, the TV evangelists are thieves, or those other people are thieves, rather than am I peddling internet theology because I feel like that's what the truth is, or am I pandering after this certain ideology for likes on Facebook or something like that because I take such pride in being the gatekeeper. I think the Gospels remember these words for our sake, to say, hey, we have just as much of an opportunity to be the thief and the robber as the Pharisees did.
Right.
So are we watching for us playing or being into those roles?
Right.
It's such a stark warning. At least that's where it really struck me in my heart as I was reading this passage. Is like, man, I don't want to be a thief. I don't want to just come to my sheep when I need fleece or I need meat, or like you said, 401k, or anything that I can get out from this relationship as if it's contractual. But how am I looking at it as somebody who wants to feed and care for them first and foremost?
Yeah, and this is, again, like, so critical right now, where our communities feel very disconnected. And so, who are the flocks these days? I mean, even local churches are struggling with this. That sense of community is breaking down in a lot of places. Sometimes people do feel like they have more community with particular online groups, and they feel like they have community in their own, like, local area. And so this becomes particularly difficult of determining who really is caring for the sheep, right? And who is looking out for themselves. And for us too, as pastors and ministers, that every time we step into the pulpit, and this is horrifying to say in some ways, but every time we step in the pulpit, there is a question that in some sense only we can answer, that today, are you going to be a thief, or are you going to be a shepherd, right? And it's not a given. It's not a given. And so, yeah, I love the way this passage talks about my sheep know my voice, and they won't respond to the voice of the thief or the robber. and the trust, man, the trust that the gospel writer has there. Because today I think, are you sure about that, Jesus? Are you sure? Because I know some really wonderful, God-fearing people who I feel like sometimes have been bamboozled by people who, can kind of put together a slick presentation or write a mean blog. I feel like the gospel writer has a lot more faith maybe in the sheep sometimes than I do. But I also have to remember too, when I preach this passage, it's an indictment on the leadership. It's not an indictment on the flock. I didn't write about this in the commentary, and this is something that I'm still kind of wrestling with myself, but to remember that there is a sense in which, and not for every passage, there's plenty of passages that you, like, there's a little bit more personal responsibility to have, but this is really saying that if the flock have been led astray, someone is to account for this, right? I think sometimes when we're critical of the church, we end up being really critical of the sheep, and we don't lay blame where blame is due. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And we end up kind of doubly harming the people who really have been preyed upon in some ways by voices out there that are very loud and compelling. And I don't know. So anyways, I like to keep my frame of reference the fact that this really is an indictment to leaders, and hopefully for lay that are hearing this as well, I'm recognizing, wow, it's important to have my ears attuned to the voice of the Good Shepherd so that I know that voice when it calls.
Right. Wow. That's so good. Well, before we move into some more, like, how, maybe answering the question, how can we preach this and invite our congregations into understanding this message? Reflecting on my own context, I've been really wrestling with the fact. So Boise is probably one of the #1 growing cities in the nation right now. We are kind of scheduled to reach the peak of 350,000 in our city by 2019 or so. So we're rapidly growing, and just within the last 3 months, we've had 12 church plants from just all over the place because they're seeing our expansion. We have a low cost of living, and some churches want to come in and kind of reap off of that growth. But the one theme that we're seeing is that nobody's talking to each other. So those churches from across the theological spectrum are coming in, and in several cases, they've planted right across the street from each other. And so I think, at least for local pastors who have been like me pastoring in the area, I've been born and raised in Idaho, so it's been my area of ministry for as long as I can remember. I think the tendency or the temptation is to look at our pen as containment. Like, you are my sheep, you will stay here. We don't want to share you with these other shepherds that might be moving into the area, or that might have better tasting hay than we do, just to push the metaphor as far as it'll go. But
the grass is always greener.
Exactly. The grass is always greener. But like, to see how to not forget our role as shepherds to feed our sheep. I remember Scott Daniels sharing a story about his grandfather after his very first sermon. He got up and gave this really kind of brimstone sermon, just tearing people apart for their sins and stuff like that. And I'm sure it wasn't as bad as he remembers, but he came down, and his grandpa said something that he said he'll never forget. I don't think I will either, but he said, Scott, sheep can be slaughtered one time. It can be sheared twice a year, but they have to be fed every single day. And that just really hit home to me, because the role of the shepherd is not only, am I going to be a robber, but how am I going to feed now that I understand my role as shepherd?
Yeah.
And so maybe moving into how we might preach this, would you maybe suggest this Sunday as a Sunday of saying, this is how I'm discovering myself as a shepherd? Maybe taking it as a personal, like, put the spotlight on ourselves as the pastor, to say, this is who I desire to be as your shepherd. This is how I desire to feed you, and to kind of let the sheep know the love that the shepherd has for them. I don't know. What would your thoughts be?
And Ben, I think that's beautiful. It's whenever as a pastor you have those natural opportunities to be vulnerable, and to, in a sense, to share your calling with them, right? That your calling is theirs. It is for them. Like whenever you have opportunities to do that, that's powerful and profound. Man, I love that. I've preached this because I'm not the pastor of a local church right now. When I preached this, I preached it at some church revivals and district camp meetings and things like that. And so I've actually, whenever I preach in those kind of settings, have taken the opportunity to call down the pastors and to invite the congregation to lay hands on them,
Oh, wow.
to pray over their shepherds. And it's been a powerful moment on several occasions to have to bring the congregation into that where they have a role to play, right? Where they have a really significant role to play to come around their shepherds. So that's been powerful. But again, because I'm not preaching in a local church context day in or week in and week out. Another thing that when I preached this passage, it's weird to say, when I was a local pastor, I would never preach the same passage over and over and over again. So I'm kind of at this weird place in my life right now. I preached this passage at chapel in Tribeca, not long ago. And because, the context was mostly, we had students, staff, faculty. There was this sense of kind of sharing that understanding of what it means to be a shepherd, that we are all people who follow after the good shepherd. And so that there's, in a sense, a call in all of our lives to be looking out for the sheep that God has put in our life. I think me as a mother, I need to understand my mothering role as not just a controlling parent, but as a shepherd. I have these two little sheep in my home, right? And so I think that there's places to go with this passage as well that does broaden what leadership is, that it doesn't have to be narrowly defined. I think you do have to kind of preach and deal with the church leadership aspect. I think that that's just being faithful to the text, but then I think that there's room in the text to open that up to what leadership looks like. And so what we did at Tribeca was actually take the opportunity to anoint people who want to respond to some kind of call to ministry or service in some capacity. And that was very powerful to give an opportunity to respond. I'm a big believer when you are in settings where it's appropriate to remind people of the call to pastoral ministry. I do think that there is this specific call. It doesn't always happen at an altar at a big service, but sometimes it does. It did for me, when I was 14, and so I'm a believer in that. And so when you're preaching this text about the Good Shepherd, what better time when you have this image before you of what the Good Shepherd is, to put the call out and to see if there might be someone for whom the Holy Spirit is stirring in this way, where you can give the call that's not, hey, come and be a flashy preacher or come and have a lot of power and authority, but would you want to come and lay down your life like the Good Shepherd, right?
Right.
It is sort of that kind of humbling place in which I think to make the call in an appropriate way, and not a manipulative one. And so anyways, there's just so much that you can do with this passage. It is rich.
Wow, that is really rich. You've already got my brain moving in that direction for Sunday. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear about how that goes, Ben.
Yeah. I hope it goes well. I always do.
Yeah, not too many weeks you're like, I really hope it bombs this week.
Right? Yeah, I just hope it's terrible. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with me exegeting this text, and it's just been such a wonderful time for me. And I know that sometimes I feel like this podcast series is out of selfish motivation, because it really does help me to get prepared for the upcoming Sunday. I don't often get the opportunity to talk with other pastors and writers and chaplains to be able to kind of just verbally process where we're going. So I hope it's as beneficial for our listeners as it is for me. So thank you so much for spending some time today.
Oh, I love it. Anytime I get a chance to talk about exegesis and preaching, because sometimes ministry can be isolating. In fact, when my husband Tim and I started the podcast, The Sermon Studio, it was because he and I were constantly hashing this stuff out with just the two of us, right? Like, so how did you preach this passage, and what text did you use? And we were already doing that. And so one day we said, well, why don't we just sit down and record this stuff? And so don't feel selfish at all when you can open these kinds of conversations up to others. I think it's a gift what you're doing, Ben. So thanks for it. Thanks for letting me be a part.
Yeah. Well, all those who are listening, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter. We update you every week. All those social media outlets that you can find, I'm sure we have some sort of a profile there. And as Shawna just reminded me, be sure to check out the Sermon Studio. They do some wonderful things over in that part of the internet as well. There's just so many great resources to prepare for preaching, and many have gone out of their way to try to make free resources that we can just really come and partner with in this call to shepherd our community. So as you prepare this week, may you answer the call of the Good Shepherd to lead your sheep in the love that he has so incredibly shown us in our lives and in the life of the world. Go and preach boldly in his name. Thanks again, Shawna, for being here.
Thanks, Ben.